All of the samples we've tested on Android Wear so far are designed to be used for a short period of time. If you run an app like this and let it sit for a few seconds, eventually the watch display will enter ambient mode and the watch will switch back to the default watch face. Your watch activity will be destroyed and the user will have to restart it again if needed. So what do you do if you want to keep an app running on the display for a long period of time, such as showing the number of steps while on a run? One option is to grab a wake lock and keep the display on, but that will keep the watch fully powered up, draining the battery very quickly. So that's not a good way to do things. The proper way is to use a feature called Always On mode. This mode allows your app to control what is shown on the watch screen while the watch is in ambient mode. It works very similar to a watch face in that the power usage of the display and processor is kept to a minimum, saving power. You should only refresh the screen infrequently and try to avoid doing any processing. Later on in this course, we're going to discuss watch faces, which run all day on a watch, and it's the default to show when nothing else is running. But Always On mode here is useful for activities that run for an extended period of time, where you want the watch to go into ambient mode, but you don't want it to run 24 hours a day like a watch face. Here's the documentation that you can refer to for more details. Let's work through an example of how to add Always On support to a basic wearable sample. So let's create a new wearable project. File, new project, use the defaults, and make sure you create a Wear project with a min SDK of 21. And we'll leave everything as is. Now that the project is ready, open up the wearable Android manifest.xml file. We need to add a dependency to the Android Wear shared wearable library. This shared library is needed for backwards compatibility so that older Android Wear devices that do not implement Always On can still run your application as a regular activity. You need to request wake lock permissions in the Android manifest.xml as well. Make sure you add this to the phone app too, since wearable permissions must always be a subset of phone permissions. We need to have this here as well to make it install correctly. We also need to go to the wearable build.gradle file. We also need to declare our target SDK version to being 22, since this is the first API release when Always On is supported. In your build.gradle, you also need to make sure that you're including the wearable support library correctly. You also need to make sure you include this new provided entry, which deals with some other dependency issues when you want to do release builds with ProGuard, but you don't need to worry about that right now. We use the plus here to grab the latest versions, but you can specify an exact version if you want. At this point, you should be able to build and install everything. You won't notice any differences yet, but at least you can check you did everything right up until now. Let's go and modify our activity so that it can stay always on. Click on the activity here. Modify the activity so that it extends wearable activity. You need to call setAmbientEnabled to indicate that you want to keep your activity running in ambient mode instead of going back to the default watch face. You then need to override the onEnterAmbient method, which is called as the watch is going into ambient mode. You can implement whatever changes you want to your UI. You need to present a much simpler UI here, so you should turn off any unnecessary details, reduce the colors used, and keep the number of pixels illuminated to a minimum. Now let's set the text view so we can see when we're ambient or not. Next, override the onUpdateAmbient method to receive system-delivered ticks every minute. This is useful if you want to show an updating clock in your UI, which is important since the watch face is not visible when your app is running like this. Finally, you override the onExitAmbient method, which is called when the user touches the watch display and we need to restore the user interface back to normal. So we need to undo everything we did in onEnterAmbient. Also, if you need to query this information, you can call isAmbient to find the current state of ambient mode for your activity, although you shouldn't need to do this if you track state in the previously overridden methods. So let's now start up our app and observe it in action. The screen is in ambient mode right now, and you can see that shown on the screen. When you touch it, it wakes up into interactive mode. You could slide the app away if you wanted to as well. When you do the palm gesture, it goes back into ambient mode and our app stays running on the screen. And you can see the color and size changes that take effect as we switch between the different modes. Finally, if you want to see a more complex example, we have a full sample demonstrating how Always On mode works that you can look at as well. So go to File, Import Sample, and search for Always On to find it.